Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are not just talking about a business story. We are, I think, talking about a moment where the tectonic plates of the American economy actually shifted.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those where were you when moments, but, for the entire industrial world.
It really was. It was the end of an era and the really messy, complicated beginning of a new one.
That's the perfect way to put it. Messy is the word.
So we are dialing the clock back to June 1st, 2009. It's a Monday morning, 8:800 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And the location is Manhattan, which is, a bit of a clue right there.
Right, not Detroit.
Not Detroit. We're in the Southern District of New York.
Mm-hmm.
And the headline flashing across every Bloomberg terminal and every CNN ticker was it was almost impossible to process.
It was. General Motors files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
The Titan falls. That was the sentiment everywhere, wasn't it?
It really was. You have to remember, for decades, the saying was, as GM goes, so goes the nation.
And here was the nation's industrial engine, its biggest manufacturer, basically admitting it couldn't pay for gas.
It was out of road. It was a cultural shock as much as it was a financial one.
I want to pause on the scale of this because bankruptcy is a word we hear a lot. We hear it with retail chains or like some tech startup that burns through its cash.
Sure, it's almost common now.
But this was different. This was the fourth largest bankruptcy in U.S. history.
Right behind Lehman Brothers, Washington Mutual, and WorldCom. That's the company it was keeping.
But here's the distinction, and I think it's an important one. Lehman was a bank, abstract financial instruments. WorldCom was telecom infrastructure. And let's be honest, massive accounting fraud.
Right. Ones and zeros on a server somewhere.
Exactly. GM was tangible. It was steel, rubber, glass. It was hundreds of thousands of human beings physically making things you could touch and drive.
It was the real economy. That's what made it so terrifying.
The numbers are, frankly, nauseating. I mean, you look at the filing. We're looking at assets of $82.29 billion.
And that sounds like a solvent company, right? That's a massive amount of stuff, factories, brands, inventory.
$82 billion,
Yeah.
Of course. But that's only until you look at the other side of the ledger.
The liability column. And that's where the story turns into a horror movie. They were carrying a debt load of $172.81 billion.
Wait, say that again.
$172.81 billion.
So they were underwater by nearly $100 billion.
$100 billion. It's a hole so deep lake can't even escape it. The math just doesn't work.
No. And the stakes weren't just about, shareholders losing money on the stock market. If a software company goes under, okay, the servers get turned off, a few people lose their jobs.
It's sad, but it's contained.
This was not contained.
Yeah.
If GM went under, really went under, as in full liquidation, you are talking about 91,000 U.S. employees directly on the payroll.
And that's just the tip of the spear. That's not even the real number to be scared of.
No, because then you have the thousands of dealerships.
Yeah.
And these are often the biggest tax revenue generators for small towns all across America.
They sponsor the Little League teams. They're part of the fabric of the community.
Then you have the parts suppliers, the guys making the seats, the glass, the tires, the wiring harnesses. If GM stops buying, they stop producing.
The ripple effect was calculated to be just catastrophic. It would have plunged the entire Midwest into a depression, not just a recession.
So our mission for this deep dive is to do a full autopsy on this event. We need to figure out two things. First, how does a company that literally defined American success in the 20th century manage to get itself $100 billion in the hole?
Right, because that doesn't happen by accident.
No, it takes years of effort to lose that much money.
That's a good way to put it.
And second, and this is the part that I think is most misunderstood even today, we need to understand the how of the rescue. Because they didn't just file for bankruptcy and reorganize like a normal company.
No, they didn't have time for normal.
They pulled off this incredible legal maneuver, a surgical Section 363 sale, that is still studied in law schools and business schools today.
It was a piece of legal wizardry. Controversial, aggressive, and most importantly, incredibly fast.
So let's start at the beginning, or I guess the beginning of the end. Let's talk about the road to ruin, because I think the popular narrative is simple. The 2008 banking crisis happened, nobody could get loans to buy cars, so GM went bust.
And that's That's too simple. It's letting them off the hook, isn't it?
Completely. The 2008 crash was the bullet that finally killed the beast, but the beast was already dying of a dozen chronic diseases.
It was already on its knees. You just have to look at the financials from 2005, a full 3 years before the Lehman Brothers collapse.
Okay, so 2005, the economy is good, the housing market is booming, people are buying stuff.
A booming economy. Everyone else was making money hand over fist. And GM in 2005 posts a loss of $10.6 billion.
$10 billion. In a good year.
In a great year for the economy, it was a massive red flag that nobody, or not enough people, paid attention to.
Then you fast forward to 2007, still pre-crash. What happens then?
It gets worse, a lot worse. In 2007, they post a loss of $38.7 billion.
$38 billion in 1 year. How is that even possible? Were they just setting piles of money on fire in the parking lot?
In a way, yes. It comes down to what we call legacy costs. This is the key to understanding the whole mess. GM wasn't just a car company.
It was something else.
It was a massive insurance company and a pension fund that just happened to make cars on the side to pay for it all.
Explain that.
They had hundreds of thousands of retirees, and through contracts negotiated with the UAW in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they were on the hook for full healthcare costs for life and defined benefit pensions.
And then there was the famous Jobs Bank. Oh, we have to talk about the Jobs Bank. This sounds like an urban legend, but it was real.
It was very, very real. Through union negotiations in, arguably better times for the company, GM had agreed that if they didn't have work for an employee, say, a plant slowed down production for a few months, they wouldn't lay them off.
Okay, so what did they do with them?
Instead, the employee would report to a jobs bank. They would literally go to a room on site, play cards, read the paper, maybe do some community service, and they would receive nearly their full salary and benefits.
So they're paying thousands of people full UAW wages to not build cars.
For years, because legally, under the contract, they couldn't fire them. So when you ask how a company loses $38 billion in a year, it's because your fixed costs, the money you spend just to open the doors in the morning, are astronomical.
And their competitors didn't have this.
Not even close. Toyota or Honda, building cars in new plants in the South with non-union labor, they didn't have any of these legacy structures. Their cost per vehicle was thousands of dollars lower before they even turned on the assembly line.
And management knew this, right? It's not like they were asleep at the wheel, forgive the pun. They knew they were in trouble.
They did. They weren't idiots. In 2006, they approached the government, the Bush administration, trying to get financing specifically for those pension liabilities. They wanted a bailout before the bailout.
And the government said no.
The government said no. Then they tried to form a massive commercial alliance with Nissan and Renault, headed by Carlos Ghosn at the time.
What was the idea there?
To share platforms, share purchasing power, and economies of scale. Basically, let's all get together and be too big to fail as a group.
And that fell apart.
It dissolved completely. There were cultural clashes, disagreements on what each company was actually worth. It just didn't happen.
So GM is left alone, bloated with these legacy costs, bleeding cash, even in a good economy. And then 2008 hits.
The Great Recession, the perfect storm.
So you have a company that is already incredibly fragile. Then the housing market collapses, Lehman Brothers collapses, and the credit markets.
They freeze solid. And this is the crucial part to understand for any car company. In the U.S., people don't buy cars with cash.
No, of course not. They buy cars with loans.
Right. And your local Chevy dealer doesn't own all the cars on his lot. He finances that inventory through a line of credit. So if the banks stop lending to consumers and they stop lending to dealers,
The entire system just seizes up.
the customers stop buying. Sales didn't just dip, they fell off a cliff. In 2008, sales for GM dropped by 45%.
45%. Imagine your personal paycheck getting cut in half, basically overnight.
But your mortgage and your credit card bills stay exactly the same. That's the liquidity trap they fell into.
So what did that do to their bottom line in '08?
In 2008 alone, GM lost another $30.9 billion. But the loss isn't the scariest number,
What is?
the cash burn. Because you can have an accounting loss but still have cash. The scary number is that they spent $19.2 billion of their actual cash reserves just to keep the lights on and pay those fixed costs.
They were burning through almost $2 billion a month.
In cash. Which brings us to November 7th, 2008, the warning shot.
What happened?
GM puts out a statement that is terrifyingly blunt for a public company. They basically said, we will run out of cash by mid-2009.
No, we will be unprofitable.
No, we will have $0 in the bank, the corporate equivalent of sending out a flare.
This brings us to the political theater of it all. Section 2. The ultimatum and the political pivot. Because this wasn't just a business problem anymore, was it?
Not a chance. It became a Washington problem overnight, a massive, toxic political football.
And you had this awkward timing with the lame duck session of the Bush administration getting ready to hand over to the newly elected Obama administration.
Exactly. And in the middle of this, you had the CEOs of the big three GM, Ford, and Chrysler flying to D.C. to beg Congress for money.
And we have to talk about the Jets.
Oh, the Jets. This is a masterclass in how not to read a room. It's almost unbelievable in hindsight.
So set the scene for us. What happened?
The country is in a full-blown panic. People are losing their homes, their jobs. The stock market is in free fall. Unemployment is skyrocketing.
Complete economic terror.
Total terror. And into this environment, these three CEOs, Rick Wagoner of GM, Alan Mulally of Ford, and Robert Nardelli of Chrysler, each take their own separate private luxury corporate jet to fly to Washington, D.C.
To ask for billions of dollars in taxpayer aid.
It's almost cartoonishly villainous. You couldn't write it in a movie because people wouldn't believe it.
And Congress just unloaded on them.
They tore them apart. I remember watching it live. Representative Gary Ackerman from New York looked at them and said something like, "There is a delicious irony in seeing you three arrive in private jets to tell us you're running out of money."
It just destroyed their credibility. Any public sympathy they might have had, gone.
Completely. They were humiliated. The optics were so bad that for the next hearing, they all had to make a big show of driving cars from Detroit to D.C. just to save face.
A little late for that, I think.
A little bit. But despite the PR disaster, the Bush administration, in its final days, realized they couldn't just let GM die on their watch right before Christmas. It would have been a political nightmare.
So they stepped in.
They did. In December 2008, the Bush White House used TARP funds, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, to provide a bridge loan.
A bridge to where?
Ideally, a bridge to the Obama administration. It was just enough cash to keep them alive for a few more months. But it came with some serious strings attached.
Which were?
They had to come back by March with a completely revised business plan that showed, credibly, how they could actually be profitable in the long term.
So fast forward, it's now March 2009. President Obama is in office. He's dealing with the banking crisis, the housing crisis, and now this smoldering auto crisis is dropped on his desk.
And he forms the Auto Task Force, led by guys like Stephen Ratner and Ron Bloom. Their job was to figure out if these companies were even salvageable.
And March 30th, the deadline hits. GM submits their plan.
They do. And their plan basically was, give us more money and we promise we'll slowly cut costs over time. It was more of the same, really.
And what was Obama's response?
A hard no, a very public no. He went on national television and rejected the plan outright. He said it didn't go deep enough. It avoided, and this was his phrase, the tough decisions.
And to prove he wasn't bluffing, he took a scalp. A big one.
A huge one. Rick Wagoner, the chairman and CEO of General Motors. A man who had been at the company his entire career, worked his way up from the bottom.
What happened to him?
The Obama administration effectively demanded his resignation as a condition for any further government help.
Yeah, that is profound. The President of the United States firing the CEO of a private corporation.
It was completely unprecedented. It sent a massive shockwave through the business world. The message was crystal clear. If you take the government's coin, you play by the government's rules.
And Fritz Henderson was installed as the new CEO.
Right. And his mandate was basically, you have 60 days to come up with a plan for bankruptcy or we're cutting you off.
So the administration was pushing them towards Chapter 11.
Yes. The president argued that Chapter 11 was actually the most promising way to fix the company because it gave them the legal power to force concessions from bondholders and unions that they could never get in a normal negotiation.
But there was a massive, massive problem with the idea of bankruptcy. And this is something that terrified the Auto Task Force.
It's the warranty guarantee problem.
Explain that logic. Why does a car warranty matter so much in a bankruptcy?
Think about it from a consumer's perspective. You go to a dealership to buy a new Chevy Malibu. It costs, say, $25,000. You are making that investment assuming the car will run for 10 years, and if the engine blows up next week, the company will be there to fix it.
That's the whole point of warranty, sure.
Now, imagine that company is in bankruptcy court. The news is full of stories saying they might be liquidated, they might disappear forever. Are you still going to spend $20,000 on that Malibu?
No way. You're terrified that your warranty is basically a worthless piece of paper. Who's going to fix my transmission if the company doesn't exist in 6 months?
Exactly. So the fear was that the moment GM filed for Chapter 11, new car sales would go to absolute zero, instantly. All revenue would stop. The company would die on the vine in a matter of days.
So how did they solve that? It seems like a catch-22.
The U.S. Treasury did something truly extraordinary. They explicitly committed to funding a government guarantee of GM's warranty liabilities. They set aside up to $360.6 million and said, to the American consumer, even if GM disappears from the face of the earth, the United States government will honor your warranty.
That is wild. So Uncle Sam became the mechanic of last resort.
It was the only way to build a firewall and keep consumer confidence from completely evaporating. It was a crucial and often overlooked piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so they've solved the warranty problem. They've got a new CEO. The clock is ticking. This moves us to Section 3, the surgical bankruptcy. This is the legal meat of the story.
This is where it gets really fascinating.
So June 1st arrives. They are going to file. But they don't just walk into a courthouse in Detroit. They pull what the sources call the Harlem maneuver.
This is a great piece of legal trivia. It's a classic example of what's called venue shopping.
So usually a company files for bankruptcy where it's headquartered, which would be Michigan for GM.
Or where it's legally incorporated, which for most big companies is Delaware.
Right. But GM's lawyers didn't want Michigan or Delaware. They wanted the Southern District of New York, Manhattan.
They wanted the judges.
Why? What's so special about the judges in Manhattan?
The SDNY has a global reputation for handling massive, complex financial collapses. Think Lehman Brothers, WorldCom. They're sophisticated, they're experienced, and more importantly, they understand what's called the melting ice cube theory.
The melting ice cube.
The idea that a bankrupt company is like an ice cube sitting on a hot table. Every minute it sits there in legal limbo, it gets smaller, value disappears, assets degrade, customers leave.
So you need to move fast.
You need to move incredibly fast. And the SDNY judges are known for speed. The new CEO, Fritz Henderson, wanted this thing done in 60 to 90 days. But to file in New York, GM needed a legal reason to be there. They needed a venue connection.
They needed an address in Manhattan.
Exactly. They couldn't just pick it out of a hat. So on the morning of June 1st, literally hours before the main filing, a single tiny dealership Chevrolet Saturn of Harlem filed for bankruptcy.
Just one dealership.
One dealership that just happened to be a wholly owned subsidiary of the main General Motors Corporation.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Once that small case was officially open in a Manhattan courtroom, the main GM Corporation could then file its own massive case as an affiliate of the Harlem dealership. It was a clever, legal backdoor way to get the judge and the courthouse they wanted.
That is incredibly sneaky and incredibly smart.
It's high-stakes corporate law. And it worked. They got their case in front of Judge Robert Gerber, who was known for exactly this kind of work.
So they're in the right court. Now, explain the surgical part. Because most bankruptcies we hear about, like a Chapter 11, involve creating a plan of reorganization.
Right. And that's a long, drawn-out process. You have to sit down with all your different classes of creditors, the banks, the bondholders, the unions, the suppliers. You negotiate for months. Everyone gets to vote on the plan. There are objections.
It can take years.
It often takes years. GM didn't have years. They didn't have months. They had weeks. So they used a specific part of the bankruptcy code, Section 363.
And what does Section 363 do?
Section 363 allows a company in bankruptcy to sell its assets, free and clear of any liens or claims. It's usually used for small things, like selling off a factory nobody wants or a division of the company.
But GM used it differently.
GM used it to sell the entire company, or at least all the good parts of it.
Wait, sell it to who? They were broke. Who was the buyer?
The buyer was a brand new company created out of thin air by the U.S. Treasury. And this is the absolute core concept of the entire bailout. This is the old GM versus new GM split.
Okay, let's break this down very carefully for everyone listening. We have two baskets.
Exactly. Imagine two big baskets. Basket A is new GM. The technical name was NGMCO Inc., which stood for NGM Company Incorporated.
Very creative.
Very creative. Into this new GM basket, they used the Section 363 sale to put all the good stuff. The profitable brands like Chevrolet and Cadillac, the best, most modern factories, the valuable trademarks, the ongoing engineering operations, everything you needed to be a functioning car company.
The healthy organs.
The healthy organs. And then you have the ownership of this new basket. Who owns new GM?
And this is where the government comes in.
Big time. The U.S. Treasury took a 60.8% ownership stake. The UAW Union's Retiree Health Trust, the VBA, got 17.5%. The Canadian and Ontario governments, who also put in bailout money, got 11.7%.
And what about the bondholders, the people GM owed billions to?
They got the remaining 10%, and they were furious about it, but they had to take it.
So the government literally owned the majority of America's largest car company.
Yes, hence the nickname that stuck for years, Government Motors.
Now, what goes into basket B? The old GM.
Everything else, all the toxic waste, the billions upon billions in unsecured debt, the bad labor contracts, all the closed factories that needed to be environmentally remediated, all the pending lawsuits. All of that stayed behind in the old legal entity.
And what was that old entity called?
It was officially renamed Motors Liquidation Company, and its stock ticker symbol changed from GMGMQ to MTLQQ.
And what happened to that basket? What was its purpose?
It was left to die. Its only job was to exist in bankruptcy court for years, slowly selling off whatever scrap it could. An old factory for pennies on the dollar to pay back its creditors a tiny fraction of what they were owed.
So what about the shareholders? This is the critical question. If I was a retiree and I owned GM stock on May 31st, and this whole split happens on June 1st, do I now own stock in the shiny new GM?
No. And this is the part that burned thousands and thousands of small retail investors who didn't understand what was happening.
What'd they own?
If you own GM stock, you owned a piece of the old GM. You owned a piece of the Motors Liquidation Company.
You owned a piece of the toxic waste basket.
Correct, which had no real assets and all the debt. The company's management was legally required to be explicit about this. They put out statements saying there will be no value for the common stockholders of old GM. Zero.
But people didn't believe it.
People didn't understand it. They saw the stock still trading under the new ticker, MTLQQ, and they thought, oh, GM is in bankruptcy. It's cheap. It's a buying opportunity. It's bound to recover. They were buying shares of a corpse.
That is just tragic. People buying the stock thinking it's a dip when it's actually a funeral.
It really highlights the danger of not understanding the complex mechanics of corporate bankruptcy. The old stock was wiped out completely.
And as a final symbol of this shift, GM was kicked out of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, right?
Yes, effective June 8, 2009. After decades as a bellwether of the American economy, it was removed and replaced by Cisco Systems.
The old industrial economy being replaced by the new tech economy. You couldn't ask for a more perfect symbol.
It was the end of an era, written on the stock ticker.
So the new GM drives away,
Yeah.
effectively debt-free. How much debt did they actually shed in this process?
It was staggering. Old GM went into bankruptcy with about $94.7 billion in debt. New GM emerged with only $17 billion.
You just evaporated almost $80 billion in liabilities.
Poof, gone. Left behind in the liquidation company. Imagine you're trying to run a race with a 100-pound backpack on, and suddenly someone just cuts the straps. You are going to run a lot faster.
But to run faster, they also had to lose some weight from the company itself. Which brings us to Section 4. The garage sale, the brand restructuring.
This is the emotional part for the car lovers, for the people who grew up with these brands.
It really is. Because for years, GM was defined by its brands. Alfred Sloan's old strategy of a car for every person purpose.
A brilliant strategy in the 1930s, but by 2009, it had become a mess of overlapping, cannibalizing products. They had too many brands that were all competing with each other.
So they had to choose the survivors. They whittled it down to the core four.
Chevrolet, Cadillac, GMC, and Buick. Those were the ones that would form the foundation of the new GM.
Now, Buick. I feel like we have to address the elephant in the room here. In 2009, in America, Buick was seen as, well, a car for grandparents.
That's putting it kindly.
So why keep that and kill off a brand like Pontiac, which at least had some history of excitement and performance?
The answer is one word: China.
Really?
Absolutely. In China, Buick is a massive prestige brand. It has a historical connection. The last emperor of China drove a Buick. Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the republic, drove a Buick. For historical reasons, it was seen as a premium, almost luxury status symbol.
So while it was dying in the U.S.
It was practically printing money for GM in China. It was one of their most profitable operations anywhere in the world. If they had killed the Buick brand globally, they would have destroyed their most important and fastest growing overseas market.
Wow. So the American lineup of a classic American brand was saved entirely by Chinese consumers.
100%. If Buick had to rely only on the U.S. market for survival, it would have been gone. No question.
Okay, so let's talk about the ones that didn't make it, the trimmed fat. Let's start with Pontiac.
The excitement division, GTO, Firebird, Trans Am, so much history there.
So much. But what was the problem with it by 2009?
The problem was that for the past 15 years, it had just become rebadged Chevrolets with extra plastic cladding and, a red dashboard. It had lost its soul. The G8 was a great car at the end, but it was too little, too late.
And they just shut it down.
Yeah. On April 24, 2009, even before the bankruptcy, they announced it was over. There was no buyer. It was just going to be discontinued. A slow fade to black.
And then there's Hummer, the ultimate symbol of the pre-recession cheap gas era.
Hummer was a victim of timing more than anything. When gasoline is $1.50 a gallon, everyone wants a giant military-style truck. It looks powerful.
But when gas hits $4 a gallon and the economy crashes.
Driving a 9-mile-per-gallon tank to the grocery store suddenly looks ridiculous and incredibly expensive. The market for it just vanished overnight.
But they did try to sell it, right, to a Chinese company.
They did. A company called Sichuan Tangzong, which was a heavy machinery maker. They had a deal in place, but the Chinese government itself in Beijing actually blocked the deal. They were trying to push their domestic auto industry towards more fuel-efficient, environmentally friendly cars. The last thing they wanted was to import a brand that was the symbol of gas-guzzling excess. So the deal fell through, and Hummer was declared defunct in May 2010.
And then there's Saturn. I wonder it's a bit. It was launched as the different kind of car company. No haggle pricing, friendly dealers.
Saturn had a genuine cult following, and they were so close to being saved. This was a real nail-biter.
What happened?
Roger Penske, the racing legend, the trucking and dealership mogul, put together a deal to buy the brand, the dealerships, everything.
That sounds like a dream team. Penske running Saturn would have been amazing.
It would have been fascinating. But here's the snag. Penske is a dealer and a logistics guy. He doesn't manufacture cars. He needed someone to build the cars for him after the GM supply ran out.
Okay, so who was he going to partner with?
He was in deep talks with Renault Samsung in South Korea to supply the next generation of vehicles that would be badged as Saturns. And the deal was apparently all but done. At the 11th hour, the Renault board in France rejected the deal. We still don't know the exact reasons why, but with that, Penske's supply chain disappeared. He had a brand and a dealer network, but no cars to sell. He had to walk away.
Wow, so Saturn died because of a boardroom decision in Paris?
Essentially, yes. It was declared defunct in October 2010.
And finally, Saab, the quirky Swedish jet fighter brand.
Saab was just a long, painful saga. GM sold it to a tiny, obscure Dutch supercar maker called Spyker Cars. It was like a minnow swallowing a whale. It never had a chance.
And it failed.
It failed spectacularly. Saab limped along for a couple of years and then went bankrupt for good in 2012.
So the landscape of the American highway really changed. We lost a lot of variety.
We did. And GM also tried to scrub its own corporate identity from the cars. Do you remember the little GM chiclet?
The little blue square logo on the door panel?
Yes, the Mark of Excellence logo that was on every single GM car, no matter the brand. They stripped it off. They went for a corporate invisible brand architecture. They wanted you to buy a Chevy because it was a Chevy, not because it was a GM product. The GM name itself had become toxic. They were ashamed of the parent brand and what it represented. Bankruptcy and failure.
That is a powerful marketing shift.
Yeah.
To actively admit that your own corporate name is poison.
It was a necessary survival tactic.
Let's move to Section 5, the human and financial cost. Because we talk about brands dying, but brands don't have families to feed. People do.
This is the heavy part. The restructuring was, it was brutal on the human level.
Let's start with the dealerships. Because these weren't just corporate-owned stores. These are franchises, family businesses.
Right. A dealership in a small town is usually a multi-generational, family-owned business. It's the sponsor of the high school football team. It's a pillar of the community.
And what happened to them?
In the transition from old GM to new GM, they used the bankruptcy process to terminate hundreds of franchise agreements. The dealership network was cut from about 5,900 down to about 5,000.
So nearly 1,000 businesses were just told, you're out.
Basically, they received a form letter in the mail saying their franchise agreement would not be assumed by the new GM. It was cold. It unleashed a fury of lawsuits and political blowback. But legally, because new GM was a new company, it didn't have to take them.
Devastating for those families. What about the factories?
They closed 13 plants across the country. The number of U.S. plants went from 47 down to 34.
And the workforce, the employees.
U.S. employee count went from 91,000 down to 68,500.
So over 20,000 jobs.
evaporate.
Gone. And we aren't talking about, minimum wage, gig economy jobs. These were high-paying UAW union jobs. Good wages, pensions, healthcare, the kind of jobs that support a middle-class life.
When you lose 20,000 of those jobs, you don't just affect 20,000 families.
You devastate entire zip codes. Towns like Flint, Pontiac, Detroit, Lordstown, they took a massive, massive hit that some of them still haven't recovered from.
And even at the top, they cut perks, right? Like the corporate jets.
Oh, yeah. One of the very first motions filed in bankruptcy court was to void the leases on 7 corporate jets and a private hangar at the Detroit airport. After that PR disaster, the jets had to be the first thing to go.
So let's talk about the cost to the taxpayer. Because this is the question I always hear at the bar, We bailed them out. Did we ever get our money back?
And the answer is, it's complicated. It really depends on how you do the math. There are 2 ways to look at it.
Okay, let's do the simple math first.
Cash in, cash out.
All right. The U.S. Treasury, through the TARP program, invested a total of $51 billion to create and fund the new GM.
$51 billion. And in exchange, they got that 60.8% ownership stake.
Correct. Then, over the next few years, as GM recovered and went public again, the Treasury slowly sold off that stake on the open market.
They sold the stock back to private investors.
Right. They finished selling the very last share in December of 2013. The total amount they recovered from all those sales was about $39 billion.
Okay, so $51 billion out, $39 billion back in. That's a loss of $12 billion. Correct. The final direct cost of the GM bailout to the U.S. Treasury was a loss of between $11 and $12 billion.
So the critics can point to that and say, see, a waste of taxpayer money. We lost $12 billion.
They can, and they do. But, and this is a very big but, you have to look at the alternative. You can't just look at the cost. You have to look at the cost of doing nothing.
What would that have been?
The Center for Automotive Research, a respected think tank, ran a study on this. They modeled what would have happened if GM had been forced into a full liquidation.
If they had just locked the doors and sold off the parts.
If GM had locked the doors, the cascade of failures in the supplier network would have been so severe that Ford and Chrysler would have been forced to stop production too, because they all use some of the same critical parts suppliers.
So it wasn't just GM at risk. A GM failure would have taken Ford down with it, even though Ford didn't take a bailout.
Exactly. The entire North American auto industry would have ground to a halt. The study estimated that the bailout saved, directly and indirectly, 1.2 million jobs across the economy.
1 million jobs.
And it preserved $34.9 billion in tax revenue that those 1.2 million workers and all those companies would have paid.
So if you do the math that way, we spent $12 billion to save $35 billion in taxes, not to mention avoiding 1 million people on unemployment.
That is the return on investment argument. That it wasn't a gift to a car company, it was an emergency investment in macroeconomic stability.
That makes the $12 billion loss look like a pretty cheap insurance policy for the entire economy.
It does, but it doesn't make it any less controversial, does it? Because the government explicitly picked winners and losers.
How so?
The bondholders, sophisticated investors who lent GM money, got crushed. They got maybe 10 cents on the dollar. Meanwhile, the UAW's health fund was protected and given a huge stake in the new company. That created a lot of legal and political anger that lasted for years. People felt the rules of capitalism were bent to favor a political constituency.
So let's wrap this up with the aftermath. Section 6, emergence. How fast did this whole surgical bankruptcy actually happen?
This is the mind-blowing part. We talked about how the courts in New York move fast.
Yeah. The bankruptcy was filed on June 1st. The Section 363 sale of the assets from old GM to new GM was approved by the judge and closed on July 10th.
40 days.
40 days. 40 days to restructure one of the largest and most complex corporations in the history of the world. It was absolute lightning speed, unheard of.
And on July 11th, 2009, new GM wakes up. What does it look like?
It looks healthy. For the first time in decades, it has a clean balance sheet. It has that manageable $17 billion in debt instead of nearly $100 billion. And it has over $40 billion in cash, in the bank taxpayer cash, mostly ready to be invested in new products and technology.
And a new board of directors. The old guard was gone.
Completely gone. The government cleaned house. Ed Whitaker, the former CEO of AT&T, was brought in as the new chairman. They brought in people from telecom, from finance, from outside the auto industry. They intentionally broke up the Detroit Old Boys Club.
And they went public again pretty quickly, right? The IPO? November of 2010. Less than 18 months after emerging from bankruptcy, they launched one of the biggest IPOs in history. General Motors was back on the New York Stock Exchange?
But not the old stock.
No. A brand new ticker symbol, GM. The old ticker symbol, MTLQQ, eventually flatlined to zero and was canceled, disappearing forever.
This whole story, it's so complex. It feels like a heist movie, but a legal one.
That's a great way to describe it. It was a rescue mission that used the tools of a heist. They used the power of the bankruptcy court to tunnel in, grab the good assets, and steal them away from the bad debt to save the patient's life.
So as we close out, I want to leave the listener with a final thought. We use the phrase too big to fail. But the story of GM is more complicated. GM did fail.
It absolutely failed.
It went bankrupt. The management was fired. The shareholders were completely wiped out. The bondholders took massive losses.
That is a crucial distinction. The corporation failed. The investors in that corporation failed. But the operations, the factories, the jobs, the engineering talent, the supply chain were deemed too important to the country to be allowed to stop.
It creates this fascinating and maybe dangerous precedent. If you are big enough and integrated enough into the economy, the government will let your corporate shell die legally, but they will reincarnate your productive body so the economy keeps moving.
It's the difference between saving the capitalists and saving the capital. In this case, we save the capital, the machines, and the workers. We let the capitalists, the shareholders, and many of the lenders take the hit.
But the flip side of that is we also let the new GM walk away from so many of its past mistakes.
Yeah.
They left the pollution at old factory sites, the bad contracts, the pending lawsuits. All of that was left behind in the old GM grave for someone else to deal with. Is that fair?
That is the $172 billion question, isn't it? It saved an industry, but it completely rewrote the rules of bankruptcy for megacorporations. It proved that Section 363 could be used to effectively nationalize and then reprivatize an American icon in 40 days.
So here's something to think about. If you're listening to this in a car, take a look at the logo on your steering wheel. If it's a GM car from before mid-2009, it was built by a ghost, a company that legally no longer exists.
And if it's from after mid-2009, it was built by a completely different company, one born in a courtroom in Manhattan, bankrolled by your tax dollars and carrying none of the baggage of its ancestor. And that is a legacy that is still driving down the road today.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll catch you on the next one.